All right, so it's recording now. We are here. So the next point I wanted to make in cohabiting before jumping into marriage relationships is that the average for cohabiting is again, average. When you think about that, think of a normal distribution. There's cohabiting relationships that last longer than this as well as shorter than this. So the average is 5. So 5 years is about the average that cohabiting relationships last. With that, I know people who've been cohabiting for longer than I've been alive. So they have never been married. They've been cohabiting their entire lives. They have multiple children that are now adults themselves and often in relationships. So with that being said, again, that's the average. So there are cohabiting relationships that might last 2 months all the way to 40 years. So, but the average again is 5 years. And I think that's interesting in relation to some of the stats we'll see on marriage relationships in just a moment as well. So with this, another big point is that cohabiting itself used to be thought of as a lifestyle option, as a precursor to marriage. Like the goal was to maybe see how things will work out. More recently, for early adults, that's not the case. It's chosen as a lifestyle in and of itself, rather than like testing things out before marriage. In the past, it was thought of, in previous decades, it was thought of more as like a testing things out. But now it's not. So with that, for people who do cohabit and then marry, there's mixed results with it of positive or negative effects on marriage. And this basically shows us that cohabiting itself is not a very good predictive variable for how the marriage, if there is a marriage later on, will turn out. So there are a lot of other more important variables to predict whether that marriage will be successful or not, or last a long period of time or not. So the cohabiting itself doesn't seem to have much of an effect on it now. In previous decades, that data was a little different. So marriage rates have declined in the US in recent years. So 2014 is not super recent to now, but even though your book will send out a new edition, actually I think there is a newer edition than we are currently using, than I have you using. There's a new edition every 2 to 3 years, but they don't always update all the stats in it. It's generally a couple like paragraphs added to it rather than updating all the stats. So a little unfortunate. But as of 2014, about 20% of US early adults never married, and that is rising. Then in 2016, the average age for a first marriage was 29.5 for men and 27.4 for women. So if you think about over recent centuries, so even a couple centuries ago, the average age for marriage for men was, even like in the 1800s, was like 23.5 or something like that, and 22.5 for women. So this bell curve, this normal distribution with the average, has kind of been shifting up over the last couple centuries. So now it's almost to the point where first marriage might even be edging out into the point of not being in early adulthood anymore. Same with first children as well. That average has been shifting up too. So right now, 2016, and this data has stayed kind of consistent. The average age for men is 29.5 and for women is 27.4. So it's, with that being said, because it's a bell curve, that means that there still are people pretty young, even 16, 17, 18, getting married, as well as people who are quite a bit older having their first marriage at 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. So again, these are average numbers. So marriage in adolescence is more likely to end in divorce, so there's a higher correlation there. Probably some causal factors, not just because of the early adolescent marriage, but there's other things necessarily causing it. So the average duration for marriage in the US, on average again, so think of that bell curve. So you've got the average in the middle at 9 years, or just a little over 9 years, is the average. So on average, most people stay married about 9 years. So again, there's people who might only stay married for a couple months, or people who stay married for 60 years. right? So the average, though, is at 9 years. And so this is a little different than the average for cohabiting of 5 years. And we'll see a couple stats with divorce in a minute that might suggest another area of research or a question that we might focus on. But so we've got maybe 5 years is over here for the average, and I'm trying to make my hand a bell curve, so it's spread out like that. And then this is the 9 year for marriage. So emerging adults do still tend to be pretty optimistic about marriage, setting goals to create a stable life and have a successful marriage. So again, this is on average. The people reporting say that they do have that as a goal, or they want a stable marriage as a goal. So with this, happily married people do tend to live longer and healthier lives, so do more like health enhancing behaviors like exercising or eating well, eating regular meals, especially in early adulthood. So these are not necessarily causal variables, though. So if you look at something like cohabiting or marriage or divorce, we can't really run experiments on that. We can do longitudinal studies and follow people over the courses of their lives and see what changes in their lives. Do they get married? Do they get divorced? Do they cohabit? Those kinds of things. But we can't, ethically we can't. I don't think anybody would agree to this study. We can't take 300 people and say, okay, you 100 people, you're going to go and get married. You 100 people, you're going to go and cohabit, and you 100 people, you're going to stay single. I don't think anybody would volunteer for that kind of study. And it's probably not a very ethical thing to do. It's going to be hard to control all the different variables that go into things like marriage and divorce and cohabiting. So we don't have good causal data except from things like longitudinal studies. But as we've talked about, longitudinal studies tend to be pretty rare. So most of these findings are correlational. There might be some relevant variables caused by the marriage itself, or it might be other aspects that are causing these things. But again, married early adults tend to have better cardiovascular health, and it is a protective factor in other problems that might occur in life. So losing a job, health issues, people who have a partner, a marriage partner that they're with, are more resilient to that. It's a protective factor. It helps them bounce back from that. And obviously, if you go into more variables, that's going to be even more likely when it's a strong, secure attachment in that marriage relationship versus something like an insecure attachment in that relationship. So there's more ways you can dive down on that and look at those variables. All right, so here's some stats on divorce. We've got a little graph here. Most divorces happen between 5 and 10 years into a marriage, but you see after that 10 years, it drops off quite significantly. So it's interesting to me seeing this and knowing that the average length of cohabiting relationships is about 5 years. The average length of marriage relationships is about 9 years. So we've got cohabiting relationships would be about right here, where some last longer than that, some even a lot longer. And then marriage is about here. So it makes me curious, and this is something that I would like to look into or even read a question paper about. I wonder if some of the same reasons, or if it is exactly the same reasons that people break up from their cohabiting relationships as getting divorced. And maybe because of the financial entanglement of these individuals in a marriage kind of situation, it leads even those same people who might have, if they were cohabiting, break up at year 6 to stay until year 9 in a marriage kind of setting. So it is curious to me. I wonder if those are the same kind of factors. I suspect they might be, but again, this isn't my main area of research. It's just something that I'm curious about. So something I would maybe do a question paper on, or I mean, with all the extra free time I have, of course. Or maybe read a question paper from one of you on that kind of subject. But those are the kinds of things that might inspire a research question, is seeing these kinds of findings and picking out maybe there's a pattern here, and then you can figure out, is there a pattern or is there not a pattern? You can look into the literature. Essentially, the way you start doing a research study is what you do for your question papers. You go and you read the literature, you see what people have found out already, and then based on that, you get a better idea of what kinds of questions still need to be asked in the field. So That's really some of the first steps of doing research. So if that's something you're interested in, doing research on your own, getting into doing research or evaluation as well, you could do that same kind of thing. You have a question for a group or an organization or a program, and they wonder, does this work? One of the first steps is looking at research, saying, well, does this line up with things that other people are doing that are working, or that are you doing the same things other people have tried that didn't work? Some of the first steps in that kind of research and evaluation process. So if that's something you're interested in, let me know. I can give you some pointers on like career trajectory for those kinds of things. Or if it's an interesting question, write a question paper about it and I'll read it. That'd be fun. So with that, after divorce, there tends to be higher rates of depression, anxiety, physical illness, suicide, as well as motor vehicle accidents. So again, this is correlational data. You can't take a group of 1,000 people and say, hey, you 500 couples, you're divorced now. You 500 couples, you're still married. So this is longitudinal as well as mostly correlational data to say this. So it's not necessarily saying that divorce is causing more people to commit suicide. That's not what that's saying. It's saying there's a correlation. More people on average who are divorced also tend to have higher rates of suicide. So there's a lot of different reasons for divorce. These are some that are of the most common that are reported in a lot of different studies and studied over and found to be similar across a lot of people who are divorced in the US. So growing apart, arguments, lack of respect, adultery, these are all things that people mention as some of the causes for things that led to their divorce. Also, being married too young, domestic violence, having different religious affiliations, and having parents who are divorced are also highly correlated with divorce. So that's not to say that every single person who has parents who are divorced will definitely be getting divorced. Just statistically, it's a little higher likelihood. So those are correlated with each other. So it's not necessarily that having divorced parents is a causal variable that leads everybody with divorced parents to then have a divorce. So hopefully you're understanding things like correlation and causation as we've talked about all these different variables, just bringing it up again, because correlation versus causation is definitely something that'll be on your final, which I mean, probably not really going to be on your exam 3. I don't think any of those questions were specifically about correlation versus causation, but it's definitely on your final exam, so just bringing it up again. All right, so there are things that you can do to deal with divorce and bounce back from it, be more resilient afterwards. So these first two pointers or tips from your book are basically a summary of the research that shows things that will help specifically after a breakup of a relationship. So I think they're really useful, not just for divorce relationships, but a lot of different relationships. The last two are actually really good pointers on research from resilience on ways that we can bounce back from a lot of different challenges. So let's go with these first two that are really specific to relationships themselves. So thinking of that divorce as a chance to grow personally and develop positive relationships in the future. So that's something that divorce gives the opportunity for, or even a breakup, is seeing that as a chance to grow personally and develop more positive relationships in the future. That can be really beneficial and really helpful to help bounce back from that kind of challenge of a breakup or a divorce. So during the time of a divorce, making decisions carefully, realizing that the consequences in relation to work, lovers or partners and children might last a lifetime. So if you're having a breakup but you still want to be involved with this person as a friend or co-parenting shared children, the decisions that you make during that time can be really important for the trajectory of what's going to happen in the rest of your lifespan. So making those decisions carefully. So these last two are, I mean, really good for divorce or relationships, but also good pointers for resilience in other challenges in life. So this first one, focus more on the future than the past. So thinking about what's most important to you going forward, thinking about your life, setting challenging goals, and then planning how to reach those goals. So this goes back to meaning and purpose that we talked about last time. It's related to that. It's related to things like identity as well. So even if the challenge is something like a natural disaster has picked up your car and destroyed it in a tornado or something like that. I don't know why that was my example that I came up with, but a challenge like that, a natural disaster, a pandemic, a divorce, a breakup, a family member dying, a close friend dying, things like this, focusing on the future, thinking about the goals that you have, setting challenging goals and planning to reach those is a really big way to help you be resilient and bounce back from those kinds of challenges. The last one here, using your strengths and resources to cope with difficulties, is again, while it's here in this dealing with divorce section, it's also really good research in resilience. It helps you bounce back from a lot of challenges, whether that again be your car's taken away by a tornado or a pandemic or whatever it is. Use the strengths that you have. With that, figure out the kinds of strengths that you have, and those strengths can help you cope with difficulties that you have. With that being said, one thing that could be really relevant to you, if you're curious about your strengths, I'm going to pull up a website here. So the VIA, oh goodness, Google, yes, I'm a real person. All right, so this website, the VIA, the Values in Action Character Strength Survey, this is a well-researched, basically assessment of the strengths that you might have. There is a total of 24, and they're under, what is it, 6 or 7 core strengths. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So these are the general categories of strengths. So wisdom strengths, courage strengths, humanity strengths, justice strengths, temperance strengths, and transcendent strengths. And then here's a list of all the different ones. So these are all examples of things that can be protective factors in any kind of challenge you have. So taking this VIA survey, you can basically think of it as a personality test for character strengths. So whichever ones that you score low on are things that aren't necessarily strengths that you have. Things that you score high on are strengths that you have now. So that can give you a lot of information. If you find that you're low on prudence, but it's something you want to work on, this website also comes from Positive Psychology. They have things to work on to improve your prudence or improve your teamwork, improve your spirituality, improve your perspective, improve your kindness, things like that. And so this is actually something I do. I learned about in actually my first year of graduate school doing positive psychology classes. So I took it then, and I basically take it every year to see how my strengths are changing over time. And if one seems to be going lower, if I want to work on that. That hasn't been the case so far. Just kind of watching and being curious about like, what is it showing my strengths are right now. So a good resource for you. All of you should probably take the adult version. There's an adolescent version that's a lot shorter, so easier to take. But basically, you just have to give sign away your data to them that you are taking in the survey. So give them your survey data and let them send you. Honestly, I think I get an email from them twice a year is all I've ever gotten. Yeah, but you can do that for free. Might be useful to you. Sorry, a little bit tangential, but it might be helpful for any of you who are thinking about how could you use your strengths to cope with any kind of difficulties. So again, this specifically is related to divorce, but using your strengths, you can use them to bounce back or be resilient in the face of any challenge. So there might be ways to use some of those strengths that they're talking about here, some of these character strengths, to bounce back from challenges you might be experiencing now in your life. So yeah, this is character strengths are basically positive psychology's positive personality traits. You could think of them that way. It's not technically accurate. So other positive psychologists who research this would probably get mad at me for reducing it to that point, but for your purposes, it's a good enough description for what it is. All right. So early adult lifestyles, the main thing here with people who are gay or lesbian in early adult relationships is that they're really similar to heterosexual relationships in basically most ways. So satisfaction, conflict, the length of time the relationships last, things like that. So masculine and feminine roles are more uncommon in these kinds of relationships than they are in heterosexual relationships. Um, so, and we talked about last time, masculine and feminine roles have been getting more egalitarian. They're even more egalitarian for LGBTQ plus individuals. So only a small segment of the gay male population has a large number of sexual partners, and an even smaller portion of the lesbian population has a large number of sexual partners. So this is a thing that was, I don't feel like it's a stereotype as much now, but even a decade ago, it was a pretty big stereotype that people who are gay or lesbian have a lot of different sexual partners, when in reality, people who are LGBTQ plus tend to prefer long-term and committed relationships. Um, so, yeah. One thing that I didn't mention last time, we were talking about the triarchic theory of love, and I do want to jump back to that right now because this reminded me of that. Here we go. So with the triarchic theory of love, we talked about consummate love kind of being the end goal in this theory of a partner relationship. Well, there are individuals who are also asexual, who don't have an interest or feel no passion, essentially, that sexual desire for someone. So if someone is missing that component, if they don't want that in a relationship, someone who's asexual probably is still going to want, and this tends to be the case, people who are asexual still want that intimacy and that commitment. So focusing on things like companionate love rather than that passion, finding a partner who is accepting of that they don't want that passion in the relationship. This is another reason I like this triarchic theory of love, because people of different, so someone who is asexual, you can see here that, well, even if they don't have that passion, they can still have a strong love for other people. They can still have a partner who they love, as well as close friends that they love. Just because they don't have an interest in that passion piece doesn't mean they are any more or less worthy of love, or their love is any better or worse, I guess is the point I'm trying to make there. So yeah, I think it's a good model for a lot of things like that. Yeah. All right, so other than that, though, that's some of the main points there. LGBTQ plus relationships in early adulthood tend to be very similar, still looking for long-term committed relationships. Many people trying to have all intimacy, passion, and commitment together. So now we're going to talk about some of Gottman's research, some summary of Gottman's research. It's fairly popular among lay people as well. So like I have a cousin who's a nurse who often posts articles or quizzes or things like memes based on Gottman's research on love and relationships. So your book does focus on Gottman, but I definitely want to just point out Gottman's not the only or even necessarily the best researcher in this area. I think the reason it's focused on so much in your textbook is because it's easy to understand. Gottman's a good writer for just lay people. And so that research and the work of also other staff and students and other people doing that work, they've done a really good job at like getting it out, disseminating it to just general people. So it is really easy to understand for students at your level who this might be your first psychology class, but there are other researchers as well who are doing research in marriages, relationships, making relationships work. And so if you went to, say, a marriage and family therapist, they might not even use anything from Gottman. They might use some things from other researchers who are contemporaries of Gottman, or even newer research as well. So your book focuses on this, I think, mainly because it's pretty easy to understand and apply, which is fine, but it's not the one and only like relationship research that exists, is I guess my main point there. Even though you might get that sense from the textbook. So love maps are basically an idea in this research that people have things that they want to feel loved, things that make them feel loved. So you and a partner figuring out what it is that makes you feel loved, that makes them feel loved, and then doing those things will bring you closer together. So share, being intimate, by letting someone know, hey, I really like X, Y, and Z. They let you know they like A, B, and C. Then you both try to do those things. So nurturing fondness and admiration for each other is another big key point in Gottman's research. So that means things like praising each other, um, looking back on your history as positive. And a lot of relationships tend to do this. They even look back at challenges like, this is just a really funny example, so now I'm going to use it, like your car getting picked up by a tornado and thrown away. As maybe it's not a funny example if that actually happened to you. Um, Hopefully it hasn't. Anyway, even seeing that as a challenge that you worked through together can be seen as positive. Admiring things about each other, those are really good ways to nurture this fondness and admiration. And that's not to say that there's never a bad thing that happens or something about your partner that you don't like. That's not what it's saying. It's saying that you need to do and focus on nurturing this fondness and admiration. Another point that I don't think comes from Gottman is the 1 negative to 7 positives. So if essentially on average, if you have more than generally 1 or 2 negative experiences or encounters with your partner or any relationship out of 7, the relationship starts to deteriorate. It's less positive. You don't see as much fondness and admiration when it's over 2 negatives to 7 positives on average. So with this, another aspect in Gottman's research is to turn towards each other rather than away. So friendship between partners, doing things, being intimate with each other, sharing things about each other, being committed, seeking support from a partner. So if you lose a job or you've lost your car, seeking support, relying on that person. And even if you disagree on ideas, still appreciating their point of view, talking about it, communicating. So this goes into intimacy, this goes into commitment as well. So letting your partner influence you. So when 2 people are together and they're sharing a lot together, they will tend to change each other, hopefully with these aspects for the better. So sharing power, being egalitarian, respecting their point of view, even if there is disagreements, and not being domineering or authoritarian. So a relationship where there is one person who's domineering or directing or authoritarian over the other partner is not as healthy and is not sharing power in that relationship. You should be equals together, and that can be a challenge for some couples as well, especially if that's not something you saw from, say, parents or other relationship examples that you've seen in life. So creating shared meaning, humans are really good at creating meaning out of things or finding things that we find meaning in. So sharing that with a partner is really useful. Finding things that are meaningful together, so things that you both find meaning in, trying to enjoy the thing that your partner finds meaning in. So even if it's something that you don't really care about at first, maybe you seeing their excitement or engagement or passion for that thing might help you feel more interested in it or see its usefulness or utility or meaning around it. So helping each other work towards goals, seeing those challenges, working through them, looking back at the past, creates meaning together over the lifespan that you're together. So yeah, those are the main points I wanted to make from Gottman's research. Questions about any of those? I know I didn't go through every single one of these bullet points. Went over a lot of them and most of the general points. All right, let's talk about becoming a parent. So, like I mentioned, as with the marriage age, is getting close to the point where it might be aging out of, so the first time marriage age might be getting to the point of aging out of early adulthood. Becoming a parent is also getting towards that point as well. So depending on the researcher you ask, early adulthood's anywhere from 18 to 30 or 35. So again, depends on the researcher. Now I really like the 35 number because that means I'm still in early adulthood. But yeah, that's probably not the best way to make decisions on the definition of a construct. So with this, most parenting practices are passed down by parents. So we experience parenting from our immediate caregiver. that tends to be what we've learned through observation and what we default to. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't change things, but generally, on average, again, the changes made are small. So if you look at your grandparents versus your parents versus your parenting, you'll probably be able to pick out some similarities, but it's probably a bigger shift between you and your grandparents than it is between you and your parents. And this tends to be the natural behavior. So more of an evolution rather than a dramatic shift. It is possible to parent incredibly differently than your parents did, but this isn't the average or the norm. It is also very possible to learn and get training in parenting and be a much better parent than, say, your parents were. So, but it takes more consistent effort to do that. So we basically just kind of default to our observational learning and shift things around a little bit, on average again. So partners might have different parenting styles. So I think we actually had a couple students in the class here who had a permissive parent and authoritarian parent, or an authoritative and authoritarian parent as well. And so that can cause conflict between those parents. It can lead the child to maybe have a stronger attachment with one parent or another. So that can have a lot of challenges. But parents who work together using like Gottman's recommendations tend to parent and come together to make decisions. Co-parenting is very important. So some parenting myths I wanted to let you know about, just in case you are a parent, you might be a parent, you know someone who might be a parent. These are myths that people tend to think about having a child. And so let's talk about them. So the birth of a child will save a failing marriage. That is definitely a myth. On average, a new child adds additional stress. Yes, it can bring in additional meaning and shared meaning around that child and working around that child. But if a couple is already having challenges and troubles and is not working on those challenges and troubles themselves specifically, having a child added to the mix is not going to fix those things that already needed to be worked on. It'll add additional stresses on those things. So birth of a child will not save a failing marriage. That is definitely a myth that some people think that, hey, we should have a child together. No, it's probably not a great idea. So the idea that a child will think, feel, or behave like the parents did when they were in their childhoods is also a myth. So you'll probably be able to pick out, if you're a parent or are ever a parent, some similarities between you and your child while they're in childhood. But there will be a lot more differences that might surprise you. So children are their own individual people. They're a combination of both the genetic components as well as the socio-emotional experiences they have had. So they're not going to act and behave just like my children don't act and behave just like I did, or like an equal mix, or like a 30% versus 30% mix from my wife and I. They're very much their own individuals. So having a child gives the parents a second chance at achievement. Some parents go into having a child with this in their minds, that maybe they didn't do X, Y, and Z, or they didn't succeed in this area of their life, and they can mold their child to do that in their place. A child is going to have their own interests, their own hobbies. It's possible they might line up, and that would be neat. But on average, a child is not a second chance at achievement for that parent. The kind of sad and funny example that I always think of when talking about this stat is when I was around like 11 or so, I actually lived in Camas, Utah, which at the point before the Olympics here, the Winter Olympics here in Utah, was still a pretty rural place. It's still a lot more rural than, say, Sandy or Draper or Salt Lake City. But I was at a rodeo there in Camas, Utah. There was the option for, I think, anybody above 8 or 10 or something like that to ride calves in this rodeo. And so there was another boy basically in front of me in line who was crying in getting on the calf. And his father was yelling at him, talking about how he's got to be a really great rider, he's got to start now, those kinds of things. And the child definitely did not want to ride this calf. And the mother of this child ended up yelling at the father, saying, don't live out your dreams through your son. So this father was trying to achieve something through his son that he was unable to. And so I always think of that example. Not a really great idea to try and push those kinds of things onto a child. So a little funny, a little mostly sad that it was that dramatic and obvious and connected to this piece of research. So another myth is that parenting is an instinct and doesn't require any training. That's definitely not the case. So parenting, we tend to parent based on the things that the way we've seen ourselves be parented or what we've experienced. So we'll kind of default to that. So you might have an initial kind of pattern of something you would do, but we don't really have parenting instincts. So training is really useful for early parents. One of the best programs is to have, say, like a nurse or a therapist be in the home in the first week or two after a child comes home to help with things like feeding the child, figuring out its sleep cycle, helping the parents know, like, well, at this part of their sleep cycle or this part of their wake cycle, this is when you should be playing with them, that kind of thing. That specific training is very, very helpful. But you can also get that kind of training from, say, a marriage and family therapist. So if you have an adolescent and you want to learn how to better parent adolescents, do some training for that. So it's something that we don't necessarily talk about in society very much, but parenting is definitely not an instinct. It's something that we do research on because we want to understand how to parent well. So figuring out how to parent specifically in your context, especially with like a marriage and family therapist, bringing in, say, an adolescent and yourself to figure out how to better parent them is a really great idea. You're not just going to know how to do that. All right, so I mentioned this, the average age of a first-time mother is moving back. It's now about 27 years old. And so now more women are giving birth in their 30s than in their 20s. So this, again, is kind of moving out of the early adulthood period or the general early adulthood period. And so with that, women are also having fewer children, which might lead them to have a more free time in their lives, but it also might be because of requirements for having to work out of the home as well. So it might be possible that if they had more of their needs met, they might have more children. But as it currently is, they're having children later and fewer children, which does give them some more options for pursuing their own endeavors. All right, so with this, men are also more apt to invest more time in fathering, so actually parenting a child, versus in previous decades and centuries, this was not so much the case. The parenting of the child was seen as just the mother's job. So as things have been more egalitarian, this has as well. Still room for improvement as well too. So parental care often today is also supplemented by institutional care. So whether that's something like a daycare or preschool, that is very common. Part of that's probably down to the fact that both parents might need to be out of the house. If you're in a single parent family, that parent probably has to be working, maybe even multiple jobs, and so is required to get enough jobs to pay for the child care in the first place so that they can be at their other job to then pay rent. So because of those factors within our context and within our communities, this means that parental care is more common than it used to be. So oftentimes institutional care is more common than it was in previous decades. So those are the last points on early adulthood socio-emotional relationships. You've probably noticed, and I've mentioned it a couple times, we didn't really talk about friendships much at all. I mean, we definitely talked about it in relation to love and how that intimacy and commitment with close friends is also important if that's something that you are wanting. But that's one reason I think doing the extra credit assignment of looking at either that video or that research article and writing that little paper would be really useful, so you could build up your knowledge, because that's really an area where your book is lacking, is talking about friendships and close friendships and how important they are for early adults. Also later on in lifespan. But your book actually does a better job talking about that in middle and late adulthood than it does in early adulthood. So questions on this content before we talk about the study guide? It's definitely a different context teaching this in an online setting versus in person. These are some of the topics I often get a lot of questions for, so I think it's probably just down to the context of maybe not having as much of a I don't know if it's down to like the screen and things being recorded that we're not asking questions and things like that. I'm not sure what are the aspects that lead not as many questions to be asked when I teach this in an online type of setting like this. But let's take a quick break. Let's be back at 10:55 and we'll start going over the exam study guide. In the meantime, while we're taking that quick break, if you want to put in the meeting chat any questions you have, so if you're like, I want to go over number 4 or what's the answer to number 14 or something like that, put those in the chat as well. But we'll take a quick break so we can get a drink. If anybody doesn't want to be involved in looking at the study guide as well, feel free to take off as well. So I'm going to stop the recording here also. So if you want to stick around and go over the study guide, feel free to do so. If not, enjoy the beginning of your April, and we'll be back at 10:55 to go over the study guide. All right, so quick break.